Okay, welcome back everybody, and I think I got the network issue figured out at. I mean, like, so it's funny, like, or let me rewind a bit. So, I tried a test run of a stream on Monday, and it was worked perfectly fine. And I thanked IT at the medical school, and they're like, "Oh, we didn't do anything." So I think, if I recall, some people in the chat just before I totally dropped off said something funky was going on at Manoa. And they said, like, apparently I didn't call Manoa that day or last week Friday. I should have, because I guess maybe it was a Manoa problem and not actually a med school problem. So hopefully my streams will be fine for the rest of this year as long as we're online. But yeah, I'm just playing it very cautious and broadcasting from home right now. And yes, that was Mr. Peanut. So if you hear random whistles and clicks and chirps and burp noises, that's him. So don't mind him, he's just being happy. And again, it's the day before Thanksgiving. If you have somewhere else to be, if you're still doing last minute shopping, by all means go out and do your shopping. This lecture will be up later on. So just to go there, just do whatever you need to do. And if you need a day off, if you need a mental health day, yeah, this is the day to take it. Because again, nothing is really happening other than just today's lecture, which I'm recording, and it'll be up later. So let's go on. So here's the thing, like, I know I had to change the subject of this one a bit, but even though it's like, this is the last chapter, the central nervous system chapter in the OSU version. And remember, like, the weird thing about OSU and Martini versus Martini and OpenStax is that they all kind of arrange the part after nervous tissue differently. So this is how the old version of OpenStax used to be. And again, they did change things around. Like, they have somatic nervous system, which is like a very bare bones one. Then the autonomic nervous system and the neurological exam chapter they love so much. This is how Martini does their chapter 15. So at the beginning of the nervous system, or after they're done with nervous tissue, they give an overview of chapters 13 and 14. So they split it between the central nervous system, the spinal cord, and the brain and cranial nerves. And chapter 15 was it's kind of if you try to read the Martini version, it is a really strange chapter, because it's both, you need the central nervous system, but you also need the peripheral nervous system. So it's this kind of weird in-between chapter. It's almost like everything that's not explicitly the peripheral nervous system, everything that's not explicitly the brain and spinal cord, but it's still important stuff we don't know where to put in otherwise. So that's kind of what chapter 15 is in the Martini. So Martini is more about the afferent and efferent signals going to and from the central nervous system. And again, like, especially the last chapter of the OSU book, the last section of the central nervous system chapter, the sensory motor pathways, they involve both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So it is kind of it's not strictly central nervous system, but they figured, okay, we already talked about peripheral, we talked about central, now let's talk about how they all go together. Okay, so what are afferent sensory signals? We covered this like pretty much right after nervous tissue. So what are they? Well, you have some change in the environment, internal or external, or proprioceptive, and then your sensory receptor cells and neurons and these proteins on these neurons, they detect something, they depolarize these cells or neurons, and then that results in action potentials. Action potentials are due to that movement of ions across your cell's membranes. And then that ends up going to these pathways. So remember, all these synapses are how these neurons communicate with each other, and then it ends up at your central nervous system. Now, your general versus special senses. So we did cover that. So again, general senses, these are the ones that you can feel or sense throughout multiple areas of your body. So they're not localized to just one specific organ. And these are the lists over here, and again, this is in previous lectures as well. Now, how do these signals end up at your central nervous system? So we know that these are stimuli, are changes in the environment, and they're carried by these afferent sensory pathways up to your central nervous system. So they go through these sensory receptor neurons, and then they at least reach the spinal cord, and what leads to our sense of consciousness and how we see the world, it ends up going to our central nervous system. And these where those polysynaptic pathways are. So there are three main pathways. So the ones we've talked about are the spinal cerebellar pathway, the spinothalamic, and the dorsal column, sometimes called the posterior column. Again, in humans, dorsal and posterior are used interchangeably. And these are what we call, well, let's ask the chat real quick. So when you go up a staircase, you climb up, is it called ascending or descending? Or say you're traveling home for the holidays, when the plane takes off and goes upwards, is it ascending or descending? Yep, ascending. Yep. So looks like people got it. So ascending a staircase means you're going up. Same with these pathways. They're going up your spinal cord and up into your brain. So they're ascending. So these are ascending tracks or pathways. Now, what are these pathways? Well, those are the main three. And where are they located? Well, remember those cross sections of the spinal cord? So again, we have our sensory afferent ventral and our posterior and our motor efferent dorsal over here, or actually, oops. Sensory afferent dorsal, got those mixed up, bad. Yeah, sensory afferent dorsal and motor efferent ventral. So these are like the ones exiting from these spinal nerves. But what about these columns over here? So these are where you have these ascending and descending pathways. These, again, remember in the spinal cord, white matter is all these myelinated axons and axons of neurons. So it's not just going like along the spinal nerves, but you also have these axons running up and down the spinal cord as well. That is why we have these columns along the spinal cord. Now here's the sensory pathways. So the posterior column pathway, well, not very surprising, or the dorsal column pathway. It's on the posterior of the spinal cord. So, and again, we know it's the posterior because you have a sulcus instead of this big fissure over here. And then we have our spinal cerebellar pathway, and notice that it's located toward the lateral columns. And then we have our spinothalamic pathway, which has an anterior part, but also has some lateral column pathways as well. But again, this is just a cross section, and these pathways are going up this way. So they're entering some sort of spinal root or in spinal nerve, and then going up into their central nervous system. And these are the spinothalamic pathways. So, this is the spinothalamic pathway. Well, what does spinal sound like? It sounds like spinal cord, right? And then thalamic sounds like thalamus, right? And this is what's highlighted right over here. So it's going from again, you have your sensory input going up here. So sensory afferent dorsal going up into the thalamus and then being detected by your primary sensory cortex. So again, this is why it's called the spinothalamic pathway, because it enters the spinal cord and ends up at your thalamus, and then your sensory cortex takes the signals from the thalamus that are routed through the thalamus and then interprets it as that the sensations along this pathway. Now, more advanced classes, and especially if you go on to medical school and possibly nursing as well, you might have to know which senses are associated with these pathways. So some of these pathways have certain senses, especially general senses associated with these pathways. But for this class, I think it's more about, let's start with the very basics. And then spinal cerebellar. So this is a different pathway. And we still have spinal, so it involves the spinal cord. But instead of ending up at the thalamus, we actually end up at the cerebellum. So these are very important, especially remember our cerebellum is very important for motor learning and motor control. So these sort of things like proprioception, this is very important for the spinal cerebellar pathway, because knowing where your body is and how stretched out your arms and whatnot, or your joints and different parts of your body are and where they are very important in controlling your movement as well. So go spinal to the cerebellum, and this is why it's called the spinal cerebellar pathway. Again, it's entering this dorsal roots over here and ending up and going up, so it's still an ascending pathway. Now here's the posterior, sometimes called dorsal column pathway, and yeah, the homunculus gives me nightmares. I know, I think everyone, when they first see it, they think it's pretty freaky because it's kind of that uncanny valley. It looks human, but it's not quite not. It's kind of like that, how Attack on Titan is kind of disturbing because all the proportions are totally out of whack. I think that's why the homunculus looks very disturbing. But that's just my guess. I mean, don't take that for scientific or psychological fact. But yeah, that's my opinion why it's so weird. Okay, back to the dorsal column. Okay, so what we have with the dorsal column is that, and I think it does a good job of illustrating that these columns, again, these columns are white on the spinal cord because they are made of axons. So here we have the sensory afferent signals going through the dorsal roots, going up, and it is going to the thalamus. So why don't we call this the spinothalamic pathway? Well, we already have a spinothalamic pathway. So I mean, this isn't canon, but I'm pretty sure, I think they call it the dorsal column pathway because it's separate from the spinothalamic pathways we talked about a few slides back. But we already have a spinothalamic pathway. This one's located in the posterior and dorsal, so let's just call it the posterior column or dorsal column pathway. So again, it's going to spinal cord to the thalamus and end up at the somatosensory cortex, but we already have a spinothalamic pathway, so let's just call the posterior one the posterior column. Alright, and here we have anterior and posterior, so posterior column pathway and spinothalamic pathway. Again, look at that. It's on the anterior and lateral columns, whereas the posterior column pathway and the gracile fasciculus and cuneate fasciculus, well, that's more like advanced stuff. Good to know if you're going on to advanced classes. For this class, I'm just talking about the very basic 3 pathways that ascend. So again, all 3 pathways we covered so far, they're going up into your central nervous system. And this is where we have to talk about first, second, and third order neurons. So especially if you're using the anatomy coloring book, they use this terminology as well. So the spinothalamic pathway, there are 3 main neurons. And by main, I mean that if you take these 3 neurons, they make up the majority of the length. In the time we see, I don't know if I already told you at the beginning of the nervous system, but if there's any part of our textbook that will probably change the most, it would probably be the nervous system or immune system, and then maybe the endocrine system. So we're always finding new things about the nervous system and neurons, and what we found out is that there's actually smaller neurons between these first, second, and third order neurons, but I'm not going to ask you about that. That's more like a bleeding edge or maybe bleeding edge like 2 years ago, but that's more like a detail that's come out relatively recently. So there are 3 main neurons linking the spina, going from the spinal cord, or like from the sensory signal that enters the spinal cord, and then from the stimulus up to the primary sensory cortex in the spinothalamic pathway. Now the posterior column pathway, there are 3 as well. In the spinal cerebellar, there are 2. So instead of having 3, now you have pretty much, it's fewer steps to get to where you want to be. So I like to think of it this way. It's kind of like if you're taking a flight somewhere, or if you're taking the bus somewhere, how many connections do you need to take? How many buses, how many planes do you need to get to your destination? So this is what I mean by first, second, and third order neurons. How many neurons do you need to go from that stimulus and then end up at the brain somehow? So with the spinothalamic pathway, the stimulus is your origin, your starting point. So how do you get that stimulus to the brain? Well, the first step is you go to the spinal cord. So these are your sensory afferent dorsal nerves that end up at the spinal cord. Then you go from the spinal cord to the thalamus, and again this is ascending, going up here. And then you go from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex or primary sensory cortex. So what do we have? Well, how many connections do we have? 1, 2, 3. So these are your first, second, and third order neurons. So again, it's like how many buses or how many planes do you need to take to get to your destination. So we have we have to make 3 main hops to get to where we need to be. Now for our posterior dorsal column, what do we have? Well, stimulus. But another interesting thing is like this, why it's different from the spinothalamic pathway, is that the first stop ended up at the spinal cord. But in the posterior column, what we have is actually this sensory neuron going all the way up to this medulla. I still like saying medulla, especially when you say medullary. It's like it's medullary, but why don't call it medullary? Okay, I don't know. It's like, come on, English, be more consistent. But yeah, so it goes from stimulus to the medulla instead of going to the spinal cord where it actually enters over here. So it goes up here, that's the first stop, and then it goes from the medulla to the thalamus, and then to your primary somatosensory cortex. So there are still three main neurons that carry each hop from the different structures of your nervous system. So first, second, and third, because you have three main neurons. Now the spinal cerebellar pathway is a little more direct. Instead of having three of these neurons, you have two. So you go from the stimulus, you synapse here at the spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord, you go straight to the cerebellum. So that is you're at your destination. So there's only a first and second order neuron. So again, what I referred to earlier is that they have found smaller neurons between the synapse, so it's not a direct synapse, but don't worry too much about that for this class. Okay, so remember that if you go back to my previous lectures, especially about the lobes of the brain and the general structure of the brain, well, the spinal cerebellar pathway, it goes up here, so again, first order neuron, second order neuron to the cerebellum. Now, the spinothalamic and the dorsal column pathway, they both end up at the thalamus. And yeah, this is different. Yeah, so what we have here is it goes up to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus, it goes up to the primary somatosensory cortex. So again, this is the first order neurons right here, second order ending up at the same place right here. And then in terms of the spinothalamic and posterior column, they both end up at the primary somatosensory cortex. So here's like a very abstract way of representing it. So and just showing you how many neurons do you need to get to the brain. So here we have the stimulus in both the spinothalamic posterior column pathways. They both end up at the thalamus, just two different routes, both anatomically and in between the stimulus and the first order and where the first order neuron synapses with the second order neuron. Because notice that the spinothalamic, it synapses at the spinal cord. Posterior column, it synapses between the first and second at the medulla. But they both end up at this primary sensory cortex, and the spinal cerebellar, you have a stimulus, it goes to the spinal cord, but instead of going to the thalamus, it goes to the cerebellum. Now the spinothalamic functions, okay, so this is just kind of more FYI. I'm not going to go more about, but I think, especially if you're going on to advanced classes like the 300 level A&P series or going to med school, you kind of have to, you have to know this sort of stuff. So another thing is not only in terms of anatomy between the spinothalamic and the posterior column, it's also in terms of functions. So here we have that these general senses are carried through the spinothalamic pathway. But the posterior column, notice that this list changes. So what we have, well, we didn't cover two-point discrimination, but you can also look it up in the neurological exam version of OpenStax. Basically, it's kind of like, well, to put it very succinctly, like say you have like region of skin with 2 points. The closer you move them, they start to feel more like 1 point. So two-point discrimination is the ability to say like, here are 2 things touching me, or is 1 thing touching me. So someone who has a lack of this two-point discrimination, they will have an ability to say like, here are 2 things touching me on my skin, or is there 1 thing touching me on my skin, even though there's actually 2 things or something like that, or even though there might actually be 2 things touching them. Vibration, that's something that wasn't in the spinothalamic pathway. And graphesthesia, so graphesthesia, to put it so you can do this at home and close your eyes and ask your friend or family member to trace something on a part of your body, like your hand, and say like, can you tell what number I'm tracing right here? I'm like, oh yeah, that's a 6. Or like tracing like, oh, that's an X. But how do you know that even though you're not seeing it? Well, the cool thing is that the ability to kind of know where this location, kind of detect these patterns being traced on your skin, this is graphesthesia. And stereognosis. So an example I used to do in person is like I used to have someone reach into the book bag, pull out their hydro flask or pull out their car keys without looking at it. And most of us can do that. And I mean, if you ever play a party game or at Halloween where they have like they have you stick your hand in a box and try to feel what it is. So that's kind of what stereognosis is. Like sometimes we can tell something about an object just by touching it without actually seeing it. So that's stereognosis. Now, spinal cerebellar, what we have is that, again, it's no coincidence going to the cerebellum, which is very important for movement and motor control. So proprioception, very important in knowing your body's current state of where it is in space and how extended or flexed your joints are. So this is where we have these pathways. So they all have different locations. They all have different functions as well. I think the spinal cerebellar is probably the easiest to know because cerebellum imports in movement. Therefore, it makes sense to have the functions associated with that, with movement, with the spinal cerebellar pathway. They also have these smaller tracts that are part of these pathways. I think that's something I'll leave for the more advanced classes. And yeah, this freaky distorted thing, so this is, what is this? What is this weird, very distorted image? And this is as someone pointed out in the chat, the homunculus. So this is the cortical homunculus, and it's a very interesting theory that I'm bad at like historical dates, but they used to believe that, like, especially before they knew about eggs and sperm and chromosomes, they thought that we all developed, like, when someone's pregnant, a little human develops, like, with full, like, little, like, so totally anatomically correct, like, everything is just very small versions of the head, limbs, and all the organs, and this whole human grows proportionate in size as you develop. We know that's not true. You start off as a fertilized egg, and then you go into cell division, and then those develop later. So homunculus is like a small human. That's what I'm getting at here. So a small human inside your brain. That's what it's talking about. More specifically, your cerebral cortex. So what is it, and why is it so freaky? Is our neurologist just trying to scare us? Well, it's a rough map, and the reason why all of these are distorted is that the bigger the body part, the more surface area and thus more neurons you have dedicated toward that certain body part. So larger areas, the more neurons are dedicated to that part. So imagine this, like, if you have like something tickle or like a fly land on your back, you might not even notice it at all, or you might feel like, oh, something's tickling my back, but it's kind of hard to find out where it is. Or just like when you have an itch, sometimes it's like, oh, I know I have an itch back there, but I'm not exactly sure where. But if you have an itch on your face, you're pretty sure you know where that is. Like, you're able to zoom in on it without having to kind of like feel around like, oh yeah, that's where the itch is. Or if a fly lands on your face, you know exactly where it is as well. And look at the tongue as over here. So notice that the tongue, I mean, our tongue is not as big as our neck and shoulders over here, right? Our tongue is overrepresented because our tongue is very, very sensitive. So, like, our tongue is very sensitive to temperature. Or if you've ever had like a cavity or a broken tooth, you might be like, oh my god, it feels like half my tooth is gone. That hole is really huge. Well, if you actually looked at the mirror, or like if you look at the x-ray, if your dentist allows you to see the images, you might think, oh, it's just a tiny cavity, or it's a tiny chip. Even though it feels like a big chip to you, maybe it's like a tiny sliver like this. Well, it's because your tongue is very sensitive as well, so it's very good at kind of feeling these details, and it kind of, it's like, oh, the gap or whatever structures feel bigger to your tongue than it actually is in real life. So this is where you have precentral gyrus, which is your motor strip over here. But here we have your postcentral gyrus. Again, we have that central sulcus over here. And this is the primary somatosensory cortex. So it's not in the frontal lobe, it's behind and posterior to that sulcus over here. And if we zoom in, well, this is where we have these parts of the body kind of dedicated to that. So here we have the trunk. So again, this is why compared to our fingertips, compared to our face and eyes and lips and mouth and tongue, like our trunk isn't very sensitive and good at locating where things are, compared to definitely things all up here. And look, our entire lower limb just has like that small chunk compared to the rest of your head, which has more area dedicated to it. So this is why these areas are way more sensitive. Or if I think there was like there was this anime, I know I'm totally being geek here, but it was called Food Wars, and I know that one of the characters, she was able to tell the temperature of the food just by her tasting it because the lips are more sensitive. Or they said that the lips were the most sensitive part of the body, but it's like, well, yeah, your lips are pretty darn sensitive. Like, I mean, but where it's the most, that's debatable. But what I'm getting at here is that your face, your head is more sensitive, and especially your fingertips as well, compared to the rest of your body, like your trunk and your legs as well. So how was it determined which part of the body? So this is a cool thing. they could stimulate it, and like this is where a little sort of like or we can one map it using our modern imaging, sees like especially fMRI. But sometimes they also found out, like in the more crude areas of neuroscience, if you stimulate these areas, you can also see appropriate twitching in that area as well, or sensations. So remember that most of our nerves are mixed nerves. So if you're able to stimulate these parts of the brains, they might be like, even though they might not actually have something touching them at that part, if you stimulate it somehow through electricity or some other way, that was the crude way. Now we can just say like, okay, we're going to stroke this area or touch this area, apply temperature, vibration, or whatever sense we're testing, and see which part of the brain lights up. So that's a more sophisticated way that I would test it right these days. But yeah, this is how it used to be. So this is why it's very weird, and this is one thing. So one thing they said, this is also related to phantom limb syndrome. Say you have action potentials in this area, but you didn't actually have a stimulus going to that area. So what we see in phantom limb syndrome, this is one of the thought causes, and as of last year, I think there's not a scientific or medical consensus on what phantom limb syndrome is. So what is phantom limb just in general? Well, the thing is that, say someone gets a part of the body amputated, and even though that part of the body is no longer physically there, sometimes they get sensations like that body part is still there. So again, there's no way they can feel it because they can't that stimuli because that body part isn't there. One leading hypothesis with this is that maybe you have these action potentials occurring in the missing part, the part of the brain that was corresponding to that missing part. So because this part is now being activated randomly, now this person is feeling sensations as if that body part was still there. Very cool and very interesting. But this is where the debate occurs. So this is one thing, like sometimes is it occurring at the the roots, or is it further occurring outside the brain, or is it occurring inside the brain? So maybe the fibers that are left over are causing these sensations, and this is going up to the brain. That's one of the competing theory with the random neurons activating the cortex. So this is one of it. So is it going to happen at the ganglia over here, where that was originally supplying the missing limb, or is it occurring at the brain itself? And that's where the debate was. Well, I should see if there's any research that came up since then. But I have a feeling that, yeah. So is it the central nervous system? Is it peripheral nerves, or is it both causing it? And I wouldn't be surprised if they found out like, hey, all three are possible, because sometimes like, yeah, the nervous system is complicated, or the nervous system is complicated, and I think all are pretty plausible hypotheses. Okay, so over here, what are they all doing? They're all clutching their chest, and especially the left side of their body. This person clutching a little more central. So when you see someone doing that, or especially on a medical drama, what are they typically having? Or, yeah, let's ask the chat. What do you think they're acting like they're having? Yeah, so it looks like what you expect to see in someone having a heart attack. Alright, so here is the body, and the thing is that, where is your heart? So your heart is central in your thorax, so the pointing down, the apex points down towards the down and towards your left. But the thing is that, this is what we call referred pain, because why are they, even though your heart is central, why do some people clutch their chest, or they say it feels like they're numb in their jaw, or have numbness going down their left arm? Your heart isn't all the way in your left arm. So referred pain refers to a pain that, okay, your heart is experiencing the pain, and this, what we call an infarction. So actually the technical term for a heart attack is, or medical term is, myocardial infarction. But somehow the heart sends pain signals all the way through your arm, even though it's not actually at your arm. So this is common in myocardial infarctions and heart attacks. Now, it's not the only example, but it's probably the best known example. And again, all this pain is occurring in the arm and or could occur. Sometimes people don't get the arm pain, but this is very typical. Like, it's not surprising when that happens. So things like, yeah, the liver and gallbladder, and sometimes your abdominal organs, sometimes they feel that like shoulder or back pain. It's very strange. And especially if you have like a stomach ache or something like something painful in your intestines or digestive system, you might be like, ooh, it feels like general pain, but can you say like, oh, exactly this area? Yeah, sometimes it's really hard to tell, pinpoint exactly where that pain is occurring. So the thing about our internal organs, we're very good at detecting things on our external organ, our skin, but in our internal organs, they are a little less accurate. So for instance of our heart attack, well, look at the homunculus and try to find the heart here. And you won't find the heart in this diagram. So our internal organs and tissues, they're a little less, it's very hard for them to actually say like, okay, this, I mean, you do feel the squeezing in chest. They often say like crushing pain on the chest. But this pain sometimes also affects and maps to different parts of the body that's not actually being affected by this heart attack. So this is why it's kind of a weird interplay between these internal organs and somehow mapping to parts of the body even though they're not exactly at that part of the body. So this is a very important, especially if you're going to medicine, nursing, anything clinical. Okay, so we talked about the ascending pathways going up into your cerebellum and spinal, and either cerebellum or your thalamus, and going to your somatosensory cortex if it's going through these two pathways over here. Now let's talk about motor. So we're going to take a step forward and go to the motor cortex and the frontal lobe. So step across the central sulcus, go anterior, and we're at the primary motor cortex, or also known as the precentral gyrus. Now, here is one of the main pathways, and now we're no longer ascending. Now we're going to go down and we're going to descend. So we're going to go from up here and then send signals down. So there are main pathways, and what we have are the cortical spinal pathways, and this is also like the cortical bulbar tract. So what you should know for these is like, especially the cortical bulbar tract and the cortical spinal pathways, is that they are involved in control of the skeletal muscles. And this is why we call also, like, say, it's the somatic nervous system, because it's not going to our internal organs. In this case, it's going to our skeletal muscles, or part of our somatic nervous system. But again, these signals are going from up here and going down here. Now, why do we still have this freaky homunculus? Because we have more of the surface areas and more neurons dedicated to these parts of the body that have more are oversized. So like our fingers, and especially this is how we're able to do things like type or play musical instruments or sew or anything that requires very fine motor control. This is why we have so much of our brain dedicated to innervating and controlling all the muscles that we find in our hands. And same with our over here, like, is it easier to sew with your hands or is it easier to sew with your foot? Well, maybe if you're talented, you can or I always growing up, I always saw articles like, oh, someone broke their hand and they learned how to play Nintendo or they played their Game Boy or Nintendo DS. I'm dating myself here, with their toes, but they had to go through a learning process that's harder. But again, this is why we're able to do more things with our hands than our feet, because we have more of our brain associated with motor control of those muscles. Now, there are many pathways that descend, and again, we're going to go very general at this level in this class. So there's the cortical spinal pathway, which controls mainly your skeletal muscles, and then these are actually all affecting the skeletal muscles, but cortical spinal pathway is more about voluntary control through that primary motor cortex. So cortical spinal pathway. So remember, our primary motor cortex is also part of the frontal lobe, and it's not coincidental. Remember that from my recorded lectures that the frontal lobe is involved in a lot of our thinking and planning and decision making. So a lot of voluntary and conscious control from this area, including the primary motor cortex. So cortical spinal, again, this is going from the cortex that's surrounding your cerebrum, and then going down into your spinal cord, and then innervating the skeletal muscles. So it's going, just action potentials and signals are originating from that primary motor cortex, then it could end up at the midbrain, and then go to skeletal muscles, or can end up the medulla, and then also along these pyramids, and end up at any of those spinal roots that we have along our spinal column. But what do you notice? They're all going to skeletal muscles. So this primary motor cortex and these cortical spinal pathways, they're very important for motor control of our skeletal muscles. So how many, remember our first and second order neurons that were going ascending? Well, there are main neurons that lead from the primary motor cortex to the skeletal muscles. So you want to go from the brain to the muscles. How many neurons do you need to get from the brain to the muscles in terms of voluntary control via the cortical spinal pathway? Well, you have an upper motor neuron, and that makes sense because your brain in anatomical position, that's the top, right? So you have your brain on top, and then it's going to go along these pathways onto a lower motor neuron. So 1, 2. So there's two main neurons, upper and lower, very easy. And do we use first and second order? Well, typically you're going to use first, second, and third order when referring to these sensory pathways. You could use them here, but more frequently you see upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron when referring to these descending pathways, especially the cortical spinal pathway. So, because they want to avoid mixing things up. That's my guess. Too bad we can't analyze the brains of ancient humans to see tiny differences. Yeah. And that's the cool thing is like, I mean, and that's the I think I might have mentioned that in my recordings, but the tragedy of Einstein's brain and how that guy stole his brain and chopped it up, and I mean, we still have it, but it's like the preservation and the structures, like we don't know if any differences are due to the preservation or a lack of preservation, or the way it was processed. So it's like, oh, poor Einstein, he got his brain stolen, and we can't really get good results from it. Sad story. Okay, so pyramids. So now we have to talk about cortical spinal pathway. Total tangent, yeah. Cortical spinal pathway and medullary pyramids. So when you think pyramids, you think of this, right? Or you might think of this or this. So any sort of thing with a big base and tapers off to the point. And you might have a friend or so that says like, oh yeah, is it coincidental that the aliens, how do you think all these civilizations knew about that? It's like, well, what structure has a big base and tapers off to a point? It's like, well, it's not coincidental that this would be a pretty stable structure, but whatever. Okay, so back to pyramids. So why do we call these medullary pyramids? Well, in the cortical spinal pathway, you have these structures in the medulla oblongata that are roughly pyramid shaped, but they're not like these pyramids in that they have a wide base on the bottom. You kind of flip these pyramids around. So kind of like the UCSD Geisel library, where it's like wide, starts off wide on the top and then tapers off down here. So that's what the pyramids in the medulla via the cortical spinal pathway, that's what they're kind of like. They have a wide base and they taper off to a point. So why are they pyramids? So pretend you have all these neurons. I'm showing this cartoon right here. So you have all these neurons that are coming from this very wide sensory cortex, and then all of a sudden synapsing, or not synapsing, but like gathering together and forming these structures. So again, starting off wide, coming to a narrower area. So if you have all these neurons coming from different areas of the cortex, and they're all narrower, converging and narrowing down to a certain area, this would kind of create a pyramid-like structure. So this is why we have these medullary pyramids. Now, so there's another term we have to talk about called decausation. So notice that it's not simple just going straight down and down the spinal cord. Actually, the majority of our cortical spinal pathway upper motor neurons actually cross over to the other side of the body. Very interesting. So the decausation of pyramids is referring to this crossing over. You start out on the left side of the body, but you end up innervating lower motor neurons that control the right side of the body. Or you start on the right side of the brain, and then you end up synapsing and controlling muscles on the left side of the body. So this is what we have with these tracks, and they end up, no matter if they cross over in the pyramids, so the majority of the cortical spinal pathway, they actually cross over within the pyramids, but even if they end up going down here, they end up crossing over at the bottom. So either way, no matter if you're going on the anterior or lateral cortical spinal pathway, you're going to end up crossing over to the other side of the body. So it doesn't matter, like, do you do it in the pyramids or do you do it outside of the pyramids? So the rough ratio of this, like most fibers, around 80% of them actually cross over in the pyramids, and then the remaining 20% they cross over here at the level of the spinal cord and spinal nerves. So this is what this figure is showing here. So this is why there's more lines occurring crossing over the pyramids, and this decausation, that's the technical term for this crossing over from one side of the body to the other side of the body. Now, here we have the cortical spinal pathway and the medullary pyramids. Now, there are other descending pathways, and we have our lateral and medial pathways, so the cerebrospinal tracts, our medial pathway with our reticulospinal, tectospinal, and vestibulospinal tracts. These are collectively known, they do not pass through those medullary pyramids. These are extrapyramidal pathways, so these are separate from the cortical spinal pathway. The cortical spinal pathway is what we saw earlier. So these go through the pyramids, but the others, they do not go through the pyramids. So these are our extrapyramidal pathways. Now, why do we care about these? Well, the thing is that with the cortical spinal pathway, you have your upper motor neuron, then they synapse onto a lower motor neuron that innervates these are like the same motor neurons we talked about in our neuromuscular junction and our motor units. So the lower motor neurons are going to innervate skeletal muscle. So this is how we're able to contract our muscles voluntarily. We send the signal from our upper motor neuron, it exits at the spinal cord, and then that lower motor neuron, when it activates, it releases acetylcholine that causes all the depolarization of our skeletal muscles, that causes calcium release, causing our skeletal muscles to flex, very roughly. There's more details, but go back to my previous lecture if you want the details. Now, the extrapyramidal pathways, they do not use this upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron pathway. Instead, they have their own ways of getting to the skeletal muscle. So they have extrapyramidal pathways and neurons, and they end up synapsing with interneurons. And then they end up at a lower motor neuron. And this kind of looks like that reflex we talked about earlier, right? Except instead of stimulus coming from a sensory neuron, now we have it coming from some sort of, and let's see, well, we didn't have time to cover basal ganglia, but that's for more advanced classes. But what I'm getting at here is that the other pathways that are not cortical spinal, they do not go through the pyramids, but they're still able to control lower motor neurons. Now, where do they innervate? Again, these lower motor neurons, even though they don't have upper motor neurons, they're still going to innervate skeletal muscles. So here's a patellar reflex, and again, this is one of the things, I'm glad we're able to have labs in person next semester.
Patella tendon, again, extending from below the patella. Strike on the tendon. So that would be a normal reflex. And
yeah, so you saw that normal reflex? Let's show it again.
Strike on the tendon. So that would be a normal reflex. And
yeah, and I like that clip too, because sometimes if I haven't done it for a while, I'm hitting the person's patella. And it was comforting knowing that even this expert, he hit this guy's kneecap and didn't hit the tendon the first time. But why do we care about that? Well, that's one way of measuring whether we have lower motor neuron innervation and whether we actually have a complete reflex arc right there. And yeah, hi, Mr. Spina. Yeah, he's saying hi. He wants to help. He's saying, you're going over time. Again, if you have something else to go to after, by all means, you can do that. This will be up later. But I'm just going to finish with this stuff right here, the motor control. Okay, so lesion refers in general to some sort of injury or damage, right? So what we have is a lower motor neuron. So what if you damage this, have a lesion to a lower motor neuron? Well, if you have a lesion at a lower motor neuron, what happens is that you're going to, so this is what we see. If you don't have innervation of that muscle, you can't control that muscle. So what we often see with a lower motor neuron lesion is that we see not only a lack of control and an ability to contract this muscle, we also see a lack of tone as well. Like here we have with someone with relatively normal calves, and look at this person right here. Look at their left calf. So this person in this example actually has a lower motor neuron lesion innervating. I have to look at the original, but it's one of them. I'm guessing the gastroc is the nerves innervating the gastroc have a lesion, and this is why we have a lack of tone over there. Nightbot, be nice. Okay. So the thing is that if you have an inability to contract that muscle, whether what do you have here? Well, if you try to do a reflex and try to activate these pathways, so the cool thing about the extrapyramidal tracts is that they're involved a lot in reflexes. And well, actually, I shouldn't say. They're kind of like reflexes. They're not exactly like reflexes, but they're involuntary control. So remember that a standard reflex arc, like the patellar reflex, is something that occurs without even thinking about it. Now, if you try to do a patellar reflex in someone who has a lower motor neuron lesion to the quadriceps, what's going to happen is that they could have no reflexes at all. So you might be like, even though you're actually hitting the tendon, you can be sending all these impulses, but if this person is totally unable to, has no connection to the skeletal muscle at all, you're not going to get any reflex. Or you may get hyporeflexia, where the reflexes are there, but you don't have a strong kick, or it's below normal. So it's either no reflexes or hyporeflexia because you have some sort of damage to a lower motor neuron. Now say that lower motor neuron is intact, but the upper motor neuron is damaged. So what do we notice here is that you can still send signals along the lower motor neuron, but you can't send voluntary signals from the upper motor neuron. So you won't be able to contract, or they might have an inability to contract that muscle, or it might be very weak contraction if they try to voluntarily move that muscle and contract it. Now, what happens if you do the reflexes? Well, the interesting thing is that extrapyramidal pathways, they're kind of like fine-tuning and amplifying and regulating and kind of like helping these movements as well, or like kind of they're like, think of maybe like amplifying lower motor neuron function. Yep. So someone mentioned hyperreflexia. This is what we see. So again, up cortical spinal pathway, this is the voluntary control, but extrapyramidal, this is involuntary control. So if you do this, do the same movement, same tendon, but instead of a lower motor neuron lesion, you have an upper motor neuron lesion. These extrapyramidal pathways are still intact. Same with reflexes. So what's going to happen is that this kind of amplifies the reflexes, and we have a hyperreflexia. So again, even though with like the patellar reflex, and also just like if a doctor physician is using a reflex hammer, if you really want to, you can mess with it and totally tense up those muscles voluntarily and kind of dampen that reflex. Don't do that, by the way. They're just trying to check that your nerves are okay. But if you take out voluntary control out of the picture, then you have nothing but involuntary control, such as the patellar reflex. Now, this patient, same patient,
on the tendon,
differently.
Unless reflexes are very brisk. And in fact, there are a few extra beats of movement, which are...
Yeah, so compare that to the previous reflex.
Directly on the tendon. Unless reflexes are very brisk.
Yeah, so that kick was bigger, and notice that it's not as refined. It's very kind of jerky and also like very bouncy, that kind of kick of that reflex. So this is what we typically see in an upper motor neuron lesion. So what we can see, and again, if you can't measure and what we also see is for upper motor neuron lesion, this is what we might see in a Babinski reflex in an adult. Say they have upper motor neuron lesion, and this innervates the muscles of the foot. Well, if you do that scraping, if they have intact upper motor neurons, it's probably okay. But if, say, they have an upper motor neuron lesion that leads to the lower limb, they might end up with a Babinski reflex. So this is why it's a useful thing to know. Yep, so again, Babinski reflex, that curling upwards, healthy in infants, but as we age, it should end up curling like this in response. But if you see that in an adult, that's abnormal. And this is also related to cerebral palsy. Now, cerebral palsy is actually a group of disorders. It's not a single group. It's kind of like cancer. Like cancer, there's subtypes of cancer. There's also subtypes of cerebral palsy. But what happens is that they all involve some sort of neurological damage, typically during development, either in the womb or during infancy or childhood. So what happens is that this typically affects upper motor neurons. So this is where we saw that with that hyperreflexia and that patella reflex, how it's kind of that jerky movement. So this is why people who have cerebral palsy, well, they have these lower motor neurons intact, but something caused lesions to the upper motor neurons. So they still have the lower motor neurons, they still have their motor units, they still have their neuromuscular junctions, but now that they have less of the control via the motor cortex up here, more of the involuntary control kicks in, such as those reflexes or the extrapyramidal pathways. So this is why people that suffer from cerebral palsy, they typically have like that compensation of movement or extra movements or difficulty just maintaining stability, just like how that very shaky and jerky movement we saw with that patellar reflex earlier. So this is why we see all of this kind of exaggerated sort of reflexes and movements. And we don't have time, but you should see this guy, Josh Blue, and he is a comedian who has cerebral palsy, and he uses it as I don't know if he's still practicing, or doing his routine, but I mean, I think it's pretty awesome. He took something he lives with and he made it into, he brings awareness, but he also is able to kind of educate people about it and what his life is living with cerebral palsy. It's like, I think, and that was on a show that I think was like Last Comic Standing, and he had what he wanted. I mean, he was pretty clever and he was really good about that. Alright, so that's what we saw here. Notice that he was walking around, but he was doing all of these extra movements, and this is typical of what, well, I don't know exactly what type, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's what we see. It's typical of spastic cerebral palsy. So this is the majority of cases, around 70%. So this is what we saw with him. Like, he's walking around, but he also has these tight, jerky movements, and it slightly affects his speech. And that's to his credit. Like, he's able to overcome these involuntary movements and still produce speech. Now, this is a result of this upper motor neuron lesions. Again, a lack or absence of voluntary control of these muscles involved in regular movements. And sometimes, like, it could involve an ability to have these inhibitory GABA signals. Remember that GABA is one of the neurotransmitters that are the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. It helps to dampen down these signals. So if you have, it's kind of like driving without brakes or with a faulty brakes. You're going to kind of overshoot things a bit. Same with this sort of cerebral palsy if there's something affecting GABA. Now there's also other ones, but I think this is more like borderline med school level, so don't worry about that for this class. Alright, who remembers these? What do we call it? ALS, but what does ALS stand for? But this is what stands for myotrophic lateral sclerosis, also commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. So it causes degeneration of the nervous system and these descending pathways, and it can involve either the upper motor neurons, lower motor neurons, or both. And it's very, very rare. And this is what is a great thing about the ALS and the Ice Bucket Challenge is it brought more awareness of this very rare disease. So the good thing is that, or I shouldn't say good thing, but you don't have to worry too much about getting this because this is the 0.004 lifetime chance. So the chance of any of us getting ALS is very, very slim. And the cause, this is why they were trying to raise funds because the cause is still pretty poorly understood. Like, they have hypotheses, but a definitive cause or established mechanism of why some people develop ALS, they're still not quite sure. Things like maybe things involving glutamate and exciting these neurons, their immune system attacking these neurons, or proteins in these neurons that cause these neurons to malfunction. These are all active areas of being investigated. And also, especially in the UK and the Commonwealth countries, it's motor neuron disease. I didn't misspell it. They spell neuron with the E over there. And who's one of the most famous British, or it's British, but yeah, but from the UK, who's one of the most important, like, famous ALS sufferers? Oh, Stephen Hawking, right? So Stephen Hawking is an exception, not a typical case. this is why he was in a wheelchair, and this is why rest in peace, Dr. Hawkins, and he was like, but he was able to talk through his computer, and I think even his computer voice is like copyrighted, whatnot. But the thing is that he's an exception. I mean, he was diagnosed. I forgot, was it Theory of Everything? I still have to watch that. That's on my bucket. That's still on my like watch list to see after this semester. I always wanted to watch it, but he diagnosed. I think they said like around 20s, but he lived to how long? I should see how much. But this is why he's an exception and not the rule. Majority of patients, after they're diagnosed, they die within 2 to 5 years. So he lived for decades after his initial diagnosis. Whether it was due to his brain or not, I don't think he actually donated his brain to science, so we'll never know why he had such longevity. Maybe it was due to his brilliant mind, and maybe that's why he kept alive for so long. But majority do die within years. Yeah, so he lived actually 55 years post-diagnosis. I love it when I like prepare myself ahead of time. So again, he lived way longer. He was an exception. He was an outlier in a good way. Now, what are typical symptoms of ALS? Well, again, what happens in early ALS is that you might get this involuntary twitching. So again, very rare that 0.0004% chance. That is just because muscle is twitching in your body does not mean that you have ALS and you're going to get ALS. You might have had too much caffeine. You might be very tired. But in people who unfortunately do develop ALS, this is one of the first things they notice. And then stiffness and weakness. So what they're seeing is involuntary control and lack of control as well. Then when the ALS progresses, this is when they start to see that their motor skills, they start to lose just basic functions. Like even putting on their clothes is very hard. Like we take it for granted, we just put on our clothes, or we just stand up, sit down, or we're able to type. But say they notice like, oh, maybe I used to sew and now my fingers are getting clumsy, but I'm only like 20 years old. And it's like, okay, something is happening to your motor control. And coordination, so maybe they start falling over more, even though they might be otherwise healthy, or they were previously healthy. And slurred speech. Our speech is also involuntary control of our muscles that produce like that control our respiratory system and also move our mouth and our tongue and produce all the sounds, vowels, and consonants. So they might also see that as well. And Babinski sign, because if it's going to affect these upper motor neurons, then this is what we would see with these people who are suffering from ALS. Now what you see is like, so now it's not just fine motor skills, now they're losing voluntary control of these skeletal muscles. And then they even have trouble swallowing, because remember, you have all those muscles in your throat that also help with this, with controls, or not just their throat, but also your tongue as well. Like we'll cover more of that in PHYL 1 for 2, but you have skeletal muscles involved in swallowing as well. And then they also lose the inability they start to lose the ability to breathe. So skeletal muscles are also involved in breathing, especially your diaphragm, and the diaphragm control also gradually deteriorates in people who suffer from ALS. Now, think about this. Here we have the sensory pathways and going to central nervous system. Now, do you see upper motor neurons in this pathway? And the answer is no. Because remember, our upper and lower motor neurons, that would be in our cortical spinal pathway. This is what we're showing, and the cortical spinal pathway is going from cortex to spine, so it's descending. These are all ascending pathways. These are sensory pathways in this diagram over here. Now, thing with ALS, you have lesions to the motor output that controls skeletal muscle. So even though you have a lack of motor output, sensation remains intact. And this is why ALS is a very terrible disease. I won't wish it on anybody, because these people are very aware of their condition and they're very frustrated, and depression is also something you commonly see in people who suffer from ALS, because they are fully aware of everything that's happening to them. So it's kind of like being literally trapped by your own body. You want to control it, you want to move your muscles, but you can't. But you can still feel things around your body. You're still aware. You're still able to hear what people say, understand what they say. But in late ALS, you can't even speak because then you lose all your the ability to control the muscles that produce speech. So it's a very, very cruel disease. This is why it's very great. I mean, I'll explain further. So this was like my mom's bestie back in the day. So she was anti-Vi was like she was a triathlete and she was like amazing athlete, very like active, and she's one of the healthiest people I knew. And the thing is that she was diagnosed with ALS, and it was really cruel because like there was this successful Filipino lady, and I think she got her master's and everything. She had all these triathlon medals, and then she started noticing that she was starting to lose control. And this is my mom and anti-Vi over here, and she did a lot for local fundraising for ALS. But this is a cruel thing. Like her muscles, she lost control of her muscles eventually. So, but it was really nice because surfing was a very important part of her ohana and her family. So her kids used to take her, and of course, like because she couldn't swim anymore, but the thing is that sensation was still intact, so they could put her securely on a safe board, make sure that she wouldn't go underwater, but she was still able to feel the salt, some warmth of the sun, the ocean. She could smell the ocean and everything, so that really helped her. And she actually had this really cool device where she would actually use her. The interesting thing is that typically in ALS you see a loss of motor control going from the limbs, and then usually it's the eye muscles are one of the last things to go. So she was able to kind of like type and using her eye muscles, and they were able to actually like the software was amazing. It used to like read where her eye position was, and she was able to type out things like that. But I mean, my mom did say that she had her bad days, and of course, it's like you're very aware of your own mortality, but you're almost powerless to help to do anything about that. So this is why, not to end on a bummer, I always get sad when I bring this up, but I think this is why I was kind of like conflicted about ALS, because I know some people were just doing it for well, I think Vine was big back then. I know I'm dating myself. But I'm really glad for that it raised a lot of funds. So that's the cool thing about it, is that, yeah, it did raise a lot of funds for ALS, and now we have more awareness of it. And I think that's one of the best parts about that whole Ice Bucket Challenge, is that we're able to raise money. It's very unlikely anybody gets it, but it is a super terrible disease. And not to end on a downer, but I think given that tomorrow's Thanksgiving, it's a good reminder to be thankful, especially if they're like with friends or family tomorrow, that thankful that for their company and that they're still around, and be thankful for the people who are still in our lives. So yeah, Auntie Vi, when did she pass away? She passed away several years ago, but this is what I mean, I'm thankful my mom and dad are still around. I'm thankful for people who did donate to ALS. So let's end on that. I know I'm way over time. So enjoy your Thanksgiving, enjoy the long weekend, take a break, and see you all on Monday. And yeah, Access Surf, if anyone is interested in volunteering, Access Surf is a great organization on island that helps people with disabilities get into the water. Yeah, so that would have to look at that, but yeah, that sounds like a great organization. All right, so see you all next week, all right? And, oh, Mr. Peanut's very upset, but take care, okay? Bye, everyone.